At -15 degrees, silence isn't quiet, it's lethal. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold, it was the absence of sound. No hum from the vents. No soft click of the furnace cycling on. Just this heavy, frozen stillness pressing in from every wall like the house itself had stopped breathing. I stood there in my kitchen, barefoot on tile that felt like ice, watching my own breath drift in thin white clouds. And for a second my brain refused to process what my body already knew. There was no heat. The thermostat blinked back at me, dead calm, like nothing was wrong. 72 degrees set. 48 actual. Dropping. Fast. I walked over, pressed my hand against the vent. Nothing. No air. No warmth. Just cold metal. Outside, the wind scraped against the siding in long, hollow gusts, the kind that sneak through cracks you didn't even know existed. The kind that finds you. My fingers were already starting to stiffen when I pulled my phone out and saw the notification. HOA compliance notice. Timestamp. 6:12 a.m. I opened it, my thumb dragging slower than usual, like even my muscles were resisting. Unauthorized heating system modification. Service has been suspended pending review. Suspended. At -15. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so insane my brain needed a second to catch up. They didn't just find me. They didn't send a warning. They shut it off. I moved through the house quickly, checking room after room. Same thing everywhere. Dead vents. Cold air. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit in the room, it crawls into your bones. By the time I reached the hallway, I could hear the faint creak of the walls contracting. Pipes adjusting. Stress building. That's when it hit me. This wasn't inconvenience. This was damage territory. Burst lines. Structural stress. Real money. Real risk. I grabbed a hoodie, then another, layering fast, my breath coming sharper now, not from panic, just from the cold tightening my chest. I dialed the number on the notice. It rang twice. Then her voice. Calm. Polished. Controlled. Linda Whitmore. HOA president. Mr. Cole, she said, like she'd been expecting the call. I assume you've seen the notice. I stared out the window at the frost crawling across the glass, spreading like veins. You shut off my heat, I said. No emotion. Just fact. A small pause. Then, your system was non-compliant. I let that sit there for a second. Non-compliant. At -15 degrees. You could have sent a warning, I said. We followed protocol, she replied, smooth as ever. Restoration will be considered once the violation is corrected. Considered. I almost smiled. Because right then, standing in that freezing house, listening to her talk like this was about paperwork and not survival. Something shifted. Not anger. Not panic. Clarity. See, Linda thought this was leverage. She thought cutting off my heat would force me to fold. What she didn't know was that I knew exactly how this neighborhood stayed warm. I'd seen the blueprints. Signed off on the flow maps. Walked the lines myself, valve by valve, junction by junction. Every furnace in this development ran off the same gas distribution loop. The same one that crossed a very specific piece of land. My land. I looked back at the thermostat. 46 now. Still dropping. The house creaked again, louder this time. Pressure building somewhere behind the walls. I slid my phone into my pocket, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Because if they wanted to play games with heat in the middle of a freeze, they picked the wrong engineer to freeze out. I have always believed that systems do not fail randomly. They fail exactly where someone thinks nobody is paying attention. That belief paid my bills for over a decade. My name is Ethan Cole, 38 years old, mechanical engineer specializing in energy distribution systems. The kind of work most people never notice until something stops working. The hum behind the walls. The invisible network that keeps homes livable when the weather turns hostile. I spent 12 years contracting with regional gas utilities across Texas and the Midwest, designing pressure regulation layouts, emergency shutoff protocols, and redundancy loops that prevent entire neighborhoods from going dark when one line fails. You do not guess in that line of work. You calculate. You map. You understand exactly how every valve affects every home downstream. That house I was standing in was not just another address on a street. It was the one thing I kept after everything else fell apart. 2 years ago, divorce finalized. Clean, quiet, and expensive. She took the larger place closer to downtown. I took this one on the edge of Willow Creek Estates. Smaller, older, but mine. No shared signatures. No negotiations. Just a mortgage, a garage, and a fresh start that did not ask questions. I remember the first morning I moved in. The smell of fresh paint still hanging in the air, mixed with that faint metallic scent from the vents kicking on for the first time. Heat flowing steady, reliable, predictable. That mattered to me more than granite countertops or open floor plans. Systems that worked. Systems you could trust. That was the whole point. And for a while, it stayed that way. Quiet street. Identical mailboxes. Lawns cut to regulation height, like someone measured them with a ruler. Which, as I later found out, someone actually did. Linda Whitmore had been president of the Homeowners Association for 6 years by the time I arrived. People said her name the way you mention weather you cannot control. Not loud, not emotional, just matter of fact. She drove a white Lexus that always looked freshly detailed, even in the middle of winter. Perfect hair, perfect smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. The first time she introduced herself, she handed me a printed packet before I even finished shaking her hand. Community guidelines, compliance expectations, a welcome letter that read more like a contract than a greeting. I flipped through it later that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Page after page of rules about fence height, exterior colors, noise windows, approved modifications. And buried in there, right where most people would skim past, were the infrastructure clauses. Utility access, easements, maintenance authority. That is where my attention stopped. Most homeowners skip those sections. They care about paint colors. I care about flow control diagrams and legal boundaries tied to physical systems. Because those are the rules that actually matter when something breaks. Over the next few months, I kept my head down, went to work, paid my dues, fixed what needed fixing. Linda made a few appearances. Comments about my garage door being open too long. A suggestion about storing tools out of sight. Small things. Controlled pressure. Testing boundaries. I recognized the pattern immediately. Not aggressive, just persistent. Like a slow leak in a system that is otherwise holding steady. Then came the notice about my heating unit. Not a failure. Not a hazard. A non-compliant modification. Which would have been funny if it was not. So deliberate. Because I had not modified anything. The unit was original to the house. Installed years before I ever signed a single document in that neighborhood. I pulled the panel myself the day I got the notice. Checked the connections. The regulator. The feed line. Everything was standard. Within code. Exactly how it should be. Which meant one thing. This was not about safety. It was about control. And standing there now, in a house that was steadily losing heat by the minute, I could feel that same pattern tightening. Not random. Not accidental. A decision. A calculated move. The kind someone makes when they believe the other side has no leverage. The kind of mistake people only make once when they forget who built the system they are trying to manipulate. By the time the temperature inside my house dropped below 45 degrees, the neighborhood outside was just starting to wake up. I could see it through the frost-laced window, the faint glow of kitchen lights flickering on one by one, silhouettes moving behind curtains, coffee machines humming to life in houses that were still warm, still comfortable, still functioning exactly the way mine should have been. The contrast was almost surreal. I stepped outside, the cold hitting harder than before, sharp and immediate, like the air itself had edges. My boots crunched against the thin layer of frozen gravel as I walked toward the street, pulling my jacket tighter, watching my breath spill out in thick clouds. Across the road, Mrs. Harper was backing her SUV out of the driveway, bundled up but not desperate, not dealing with a failing system inside her walls. She gave me a small wave, polite, unaware. Nobody knew. That was the thing about Linda's kind of control. It worked best when it was quiet, when the pressure stayed isolated, contained to one target at a time. I reached the curb and looked down the line of identical houses, each one connected whether the owners realized it or not. Same gas loop, same distribution backbone, same dependency. Most of them probably thought their heat came from somewhere far away, some abstract utility company operating miles down the road. They did not see the network under their feet. The branching lines, the pressure regulators, the junction points that decided who stayed warm and who did not. But I did. I had spent months inside that system years ago, walking those paths during initial inspections, tracing routes on paper before they were ever buried underground. Willow Creek Estates had been one of those expansion projects designed for efficiency, not independence. A single main line feeding multiple clusters, segmented but interconnected, optimized for cost and simplicity. Which meant one critical thing. Control points were limited, and I knew exactly where one of them was. I turned back toward my property, my mind already mapping the layout in precise detail. The easement cut diagonally along the edge of my lot, a narrow strip of land most people would ignore, marked only by a small metal access cover flush with the ground. No sign, no warning, just a standard utility entry point that looked like nothing if you did not know what you were looking at. But underneath it sat a primary distribution valve feeding a significant portion of the neighborhood. I remembered the day we signed off on that section. Pressure testing complete. Flow verified. Emergency isolation confirmed. The kind of checkpoint that gets documented, archived, then forgotten by everyone except the people who built it. I walked over and brushed away the thin layer of frost covering the metal plate, exposing the faint stamped lettering from the utility company. My fingers hovered just above it. Not touching, just feeling the cold radiating up through the steel. This was not a lever you pulled out of frustration. This was a system control, designed for emergencies, designed for precision, designed to isolate without destroying. Behind me, the neighborhood continued its quiet routine. Garage doors opening, engine starting, heat running steadily through walls that had never once been questioned. And somewhere inside one of those houses, Linda Whitmore was probably reviewing emails, confident that her little compliance move would resolve itself the way it always did. Pressure applied, resistance removed, order restored. That was the pattern she trusted. But standing there, staring down at that access point, I could feel the flaw in her assumption like a hairline crack in steel. She believed she controlled the environment, the rules, the outcomes. What she failed to understand was that her authority only worked as long as the system beneath it stayed invisible. The moment someone who understood that system decided to engage with it, the balance shifted completely. I straightened up slowly, the cold biting harder now, but my thoughts clear, structured, deliberate. This was no longer about a heating unit or a compliance notice. This was about leverage, about understanding exactly where control actually lived and who truly had access to it. And for the first time since that notification hit my phone, I was no longer reacting. I was calculating. I went back inside and the difference hit immediately, like stepping into a freezer you did not choose to enter. The air felt thinner somehow, sharper with every breath, and the silence had deepened into something heavier, something that pressed against your ears. The thermostat now read 42 degrees. Still falling. I moved quickly, grabbing a pair of gloves from the drawer, then a beanie from the coat rack, layering without thinking, every motion efficient, practiced. This was not panic. This was response. I opened the utility closet and pulled the panel again, double-checking what I already knew was not the problem. The regulator was intact. The feed line was clean. No disruption on my side of the system, which meant the interruption was upstream. Deliberate. Controlled. I stepped back, letting the panel hang open, and for a moment I just listened. The faint tick of metal contracting. The soft creak of wood adjusting to the cold. These were not just sounds. They were warnings. Systems under stress always speak before they fail. You just have to know how to listen. I pulled my phone out again and scrolled through the notice one more time, slower this time, reading every word like it was part of a blueprint. Service has been suspended pending review. Not disconnected. Not terminated. Suspended. That wording mattered. It meant they had not physically removed anything. They had isolated it. Cut it off at a control point. And there were only a handful of places that could be done without stepping onto my property. I grabbed my keys and headed back outside, the cold biting harder now that I knew exactly what I was looking for. The wind had picked up, pushing thin sheets of powdery snow across the pavement, whispering along the ground in restless waves. I walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning, not for anything obvious, but for anything that did not belong. Fresh disturbance. A shifted cover. Tracks that did not match the usual pattern. It did not take long. Near the corner of the block, just past the shared utility strip, I saw it. The access hatch was slightly off-center, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to recognize immediately. Someone had been there. Recently. The snow around it was compressed, the edges sharper than the rest of the ground, like it had been disturbed and then left to settle again. I crouched down, brushing the surface lightly with my glove, revealing the metal beneath. Same utility stamp. Same distribution line. This one fed directly into the branch that connected to my house. They had not touched my property. They had not needed to. They used the system against me. Clean. Controlled. Quiet. I let out a slow breath, watching it vanish into the air, and nodded slightly to myself. That confirmed it. This was intentional. Planned. Not a mistake. Not a miscommunication. A decision made by someone who thought they understood the system well enough to use it as leverage. Behind me, I could hear a garage door opening, the low mechanical hum followed by the steady rumble of an engine turning over. Normal life continuing. Heat flowing through walls. Water running warm from taps. All of it dependent on the same network that had just been used to shut me down. I stood up and looked back toward my house, the windows already beginning to frost over from the inside now. A thin crystalline layer forming at the edges. Time was no longer a passive factor. The longer this went on, the more damage the structure would take. Pipes did not care about compliance notices. They reacted to temperature. And once they reached a certain point, recovery became expensive very quickly. I pulled my phone out again and dialed the number for the contractor listed in the notice. It rang longer this time. When someone finally answered, their voice was hesitant, guarded. I introduced myself, gave the address, kept it simple. There was a pause, then a careful explanation. We were instructed to suspend service due to a compliance issue reported by the Homeowners Association. I could hear the uncertainty behind the words, like they already knew something about the situation did not sit right. Did you verify the issue on site? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. We followed the work order. That was all I needed. Not verification. Not inspection. Just execution. I thanked them, ended the call, and slid the phone back into my pocket. The wind shifted again, colder now, cutting through the layers I had just put on, reminding me exactly what was at stake. I looked down the street one more time, at the rows of houses quietly relying on a system they did not think about, and then back at the slightly misaligned access hatch that had started all of this. That was when it settled in, clear and undeniable. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a phone call. This was a controlled move. And controlled moves require calculated responses. Because if they were willing to use the system to isolate me in this kind of cold, then they had already crossed the line where simple cooperation applied. And once that line is crossed, the rules change. I gave it one more hour. Not because I thought they would fix it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain there was no reasonable path left before I made my next move. The temperature inside dropped to 38 degrees. That was the threshold where things started to shift from uncomfortable to dangerous for the house itself. I could feel it in the air, in the way every surface held onto the cold longer, in the way the floor no longer felt like tile, but like frozen stone. I turned on every faucet just enough to keep a thin stream running, the sound of water echoing faintly through the pipes like a fragile heartbeat I was trying to keep alive. Then I called Linda again. This time, she did not pick up right away. It rang longer, like she was deciding whether or not I was worth the interruption. When she finally answered, her tone had not changed. Calm, controlled, slightly impatient. Mr. Cole, I already explained the situation. I leaned against the counter, watching the slow drip of condensation forming along the inside of the window frame, freezing almost as soon as it appeared. You shut down a heating system in sub-zero weather without verifying the issue, I said. That is not compliance. That is negligence. A pause. Not long, but noticeable. Then, you are in violation of community standards. Restoration will occur once the issue is resolved. Same script. Same measured delivery. No acknowledgement of risk. No deviation from protocol. That was when I understood something important. This was not about rules anymore. This was about precedent. If she backed down now, she would lose control. And people like Linda did not lose control. They doubled down. I pushed once more, not emotionally, just factually. You are exposing my property to potential structural damage. If anything freezes or fails, that liability does not disappear. Another pause. Slightly longer this time. Then the answer came, just as smooth, just as detached. You are responsible for maintaining your property within compliance guidelines. There it was. Clean. Final. Complete deflection. I ended the call without another word and set the phone down slowly on the counter. The house creaked again, louder now, a sharp pop somewhere deep in the walls that made me glance up instinctively. Pressure building. Time running out. I walked back to the utility closet and shut the panel firmly, not because it changed anything, but because I was done checking things that were not the problem. Then I grabbed my jacket again, pulled the zipper all the way up, and stepped outside for the third time that morning. The cold hit harder now, but it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a constant. Something to account for, not fight against. I walked straight past the disturbed access hatch at the corner, not stopping this time, not crouching, just acknowledging it as part of the system I had already mapped out in my head. My boots carried me further down the line, toward the edge of my property where the easement cut through the ground like an invisible boundary nobody else respected. The metal cover there sat perfectly aligned, untouched, waiting. I stopped in front of it and looked down, letting the moment settle. This was the difference. That hatch they used was control without understanding. This one was control with context. Legal access. Documented authority. Designed for situations exactly like this, even if nobody expected it to be used in this way. I could feel the cold seeping through the soles of my boots as I stood there, but my hands were steady, my breathing even. No rush. No hesitation. Because this was not retaliation. This was correction. A system had been used improperly. Balance needed to be restored. And the only way to do that was to remind everyone connected to it exactly how dependent they really were. I pulled my phone out one last time and opened an old folder I had not touched in years. Project files. Signed documents. System layouts. My name stamped clearly on multiple pages tied to this exact distribution loop. I scrolled through them slowly, confirming what I already knew but needed to see again. Authority was not about who spoke the loudest. It was about who understood the system well enough to operate it when it mattered. I locked the screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and crouched down in front of the access cover, brushing away the thin layer of frost with deliberate movements. The metal beneath was cold enough to sting through the glove, but I did not pull back. Instead, I just rested my hand there for a second, feeling the solid, unchanging presence of the infrastructure below. Then I nodded once, to no one but myself, because the decision had already been made the moment she chose not to fix what she broke. This was no longer a request. It was a response. I did not rush it. That is the first rule when you are dealing with a live system. You do not react with emotion. You move with intention. I stood there for a few seconds longer, letting the wind push against my back, listening to the low, constant hum of the neighborhood still running as if nothing had changed. That hum mattered. It told me the system was stable. Pressure was holding. Flow was consistent, which meant when I made my move, it would not be chaos. It would be precise. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small utility key I had not used in years, the metal cold against my fingers even through the glove. It fit the access point without resistance, a clean, familiar click that felt more like muscle memory than effort. I lifted the cover slowly, setting it aside with care, exposing the chamber below. The air rising from it carried that faint, dry scent of metal and gas infrastructure, not strong, just present, like a reminder of what moved beneath the surface every second of every day. The valve assembly sat exactly where I remembered it, solid, industrial, built for decades of use without failure. I crouched lower, brushing away a thin layer of frost along the edge, clearing my view, not because I needed to see it better, but because that is how you approach systems like this. You respect them. You understand them. You do not guess. I placed my hand on the valve handle, feeling the resistance immediately. Firm, stable, pressurized behind it. This was not a switch. It was a control point, a decision. I paused there, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline, running through the sequence in my head one more time. Segment isolation, downstream impact, pressure redistribution, no damage, no permanent disruption, just a controlled interruption that would force attention exactly where it needed to go. I adjusted my grip slightly and began to turn the handle, slow and steady, feeling the internal mechanism respond, the resistance shifting as the flow began to change. There is a moment in systems like this where everything is still technically running, but the direction has already been altered. You do not hear it. You feel it. A subtle shift in balance. A redistribution of control. I completed the turn and held it there for a second, confirming the position, then released it carefully. The system responded exactly as designed. Clean. Immediate. Predictable. I replaced the cover, aligning it perfectly this time, pressing it down until it sat flush with the ground like it had never been touched. Then I stood up and stepped back, slipping the key into my pocket again, my movements calm, measured, final. The wind had not changed. The temperature had not changed. But the system had. I turned toward the street just as the first sign of it began to ripple outward. It started small. A garage door halfway down the block paused mid-open, then reversed. A car idling in a driveway cut off abruptly. Lights flickered behind a set of curtains across the street, then went dark for a second before returning in a dimmer glow. Subtle at first, then more noticeable. Patterns breaking. Expectations shifting. I walked back toward my house, not fast, not slow, just steady, watching as the neighborhood adjusted in real time to something it did not yet understand. Phones would be picked up, thermostats checked. Confusion would spread first, then concern, then urgency. That was how these things always unfolded. Not instantly, but inevitably. I stepped onto my porch and glanced once more down the street, taking in the quiet disruption that was now moving through the system I knew better than anyone out there. They thought they controlled the conditions. They thought they could isolate one house and expect the rest to remain unaffected. That was the mistake. Systems do not work like that. Not when they are connected. Not when they are shared. I opened my front door and stepped back inside, the cold still waiting, still present, but no longer something I was reacting to. Because now the system was reacting with me. And somewhere, in a warm house that was about to become very different, Linda Whitmore was about to realize that control is not something you claim. It is something you understand. And the moment you misuse it, it stops being yours. I did not have to wait long. The first call came within 3 minutes. I was standing in the kitchen, watching the thin stream of water continue to run from the faucet, when my phone buzzed against the counter, the vibration sharp in the quiet. Unknown number. I let it ring once more before answering, already knowing what I was going to hear. Hello. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. Uncertainty. Mr. Cole, this is Linda Whitmore. Of course it was. I glanced at the thermostat. 36 degrees. Still dropping. I assumed you would call, I said, my tone even. No rush, no strain. A brief pause, like she was recalibrating her approach. We are currently experiencing a gas service interruption affecting multiple homes in the community. Multiple homes. That was how she chose to frame it. Not cause. Not responsibility. Just impact. That sounds like a system issue, I replied. Calm. Direct. Another pause, shorter this time. Our contractor has confirmed that the disruption is occurring within a segment that intersects your property. There it was. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just a carefully placed observation. I walked over to the window, tracing the frost line with my eyes as it crept further inward along the glass. Outside, I could see more movement now. Front doors opening. People stepping out, looking around, checking vents, checking meters, trying to understand why their homes suddenly felt different. That segment is part of a shared distribution loop, I said. You should already know that. Silence. Longer this time. I could almost hear the shift happening on her end, the moment where certainty started to give way to realization. We need to restore service immediately, she said finally, the control in her voice tightening, not gone, but strained. Then you should correct the improper isolation you initiated this morning, I replied. No emotion, just sequence, cause and effect. For the first time since I had known her, Linda did not respond right away. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint sound of wind moving through her side of the call, like she had stepped outside, like she was now experiencing the same environment she had dismissed earlier. When she spoke again, the tone had changed. Still composed, but sharper. Mr. Cole, if you have interfered with community infrastructure, that is a serious violation. I let that sit there for a second, not reacting, just letting the weight of her words hang between us. You mean like suspending heat in sub-zero temperatures without verifying a compliance issue? I asked. Not raised. Not aggressive. Just precise. Another pause. This one longer than all the others combined. Because now we were no longer talking about procedure. We were talking about accountability. I turned away from the window and walked slowly toward the utility closet, listening to the house as I moved. The creaks had softened slightly. Not warmer yet, but stable. The system was holding where it needed to. This situation can be resolved, she said finally, and now there was something new in her voice. Not just uncertainty, pressure, because it was no longer just me on the other side of the equation. It was dozens of homeowners, all connected, all experiencing the same sudden loss of comfort she had imposed on one house hours earlier. It already can, I said. Restore my service. Confirm the system is compliant. And document that the suspension was issued without proper verification. The terms were clear. Not extreme. Not unreasonable. Just structured. The same way any system correction should be. I could hear voices in the background now through her call. Faint. Distant. Questions being asked. Problems spreading. We will review the situation, she said. But the words did not carry the same authority they had before. They sounded smaller now. Reactive. I stopped in front of the thermostat again. 35 degrees. Still cold. Still uncomfortable. But no longer one-sided. You should do that quickly, I replied. Because systems like this do not stay unbalanced for long. I ended the call before she could respond and set the phone down carefully, not with force, not with emphasis, just with finality. Outside, the neighborhood had changed. The quiet routine was gone, replaced by movement, by uncertainty, by people stepping into a reality they had never had to think about before. Inside, the cold remained, but it no longer felt like something being done to me. It felt like part of a larger equation that was now correcting itself. And somewhere in that equation, the balance had shifted exactly where it needed to. I did not sit down. Sitting down would have made it feel like waiting, and I was not waiting anymore. I moved with purpose, pulling my laptop from the bag on the chair, setting it on the kitchen counter where the surface was still cold enough to fog faintly under the warmth of the device. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room, and for a second, the contrast between digital clarity and physical cold felt almost surreal. I opened the project archive without hesitation, fingers moving automatically through folders I had not touched in years but still remembered with exact precision. Willow Creek Estates. Phase 2 expansion. Gas distribution layout. The files loaded one after another, each diagram snapping into place like pieces of a system that had never actually left my mind. Flow maps. Pressure zones. Valve indexing. I zoomed in on the segment that ran through my property, tracing the line outward, following its path as it branched and split, feeding house after house in a pattern designed for efficiency, not autonomy. 42 homes. That was the count tied to the valve I had just adjusted. 42 separate endpoints, all dependent on the same controlled segment. I cross-referenced the easement documentation next, pulling up the legal language that most people ignored because it looked like standard boilerplate. It was not. Section 12, subsection C. Emergency access and isolation authority granted to the property holder where primary distribution infrastructure intersects private land, provided actions are executed to prevent system damage or unauthorized interference. I read it twice, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted the wording exact. This was not improvisation. This was documentation aligning with action. I took a screenshot, then another, building a small, precise set of references that established sequence, authority, and intent. Outside, the sound of the neighborhood had shifted again. No longer just movement. Now there were voices. Doors opening and closing more frequently. The low murmur of conversations carried unevenly by the wind. Confusion turning into coordination. I closed the laptop halfway and reached for my phone just as it buzzed again, this time with a different number. I answered without looking. Ethan, it is Mark from Lone Star Utility. That got my attention. Mark was not someone who called casually. We had worked together years ago on 2 separate distribution upgrades. He knew the system as well as I did, maybe better in some areas. I figured you would hear about it, I said. His voice came through steady, but there was an edge of urgency behind it. We have multiple service loss reports coming from your segment. I pulled the map. Your easement is at the center of it. I glanced at the laptop screen, at the highlighted lines I had just reviewed. That is correct, I replied. A brief pause, then a quieter question. Was this an emergency isolation? That was the right question. Not accusation. Not assumption. Just classification. Improper upstream suspension created a risk condition, I said. I isolated the segment to prevent further imbalance. Another pause. Slightly longer. Then I heard him exhale softly, like something had just clicked into place. They shut you down first, did they not? I looked at the thermostat again. 34 degrees. Still cold, but stable. Without verification, I said. That was all it took. Mark did not respond immediately, but when he did, his tone had shifted from inquiry to confirmation. All right. I am logging this as a protective isolation pending review. That buys you coverage. Coverage. That word mattered. It meant the action was now documented within the system, not outside of it. Not rogue. Not unauthorized. Recognized. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. Understood. He continued, more firmly now. City is going to get involved if this does not stabilize quickly. HOA does not have authority over primary gas infrastructure. If they initiated this, they are already in a bad position. I closed the laptop fully and rested my hand on it, feeling the faint warmth radiating through the casing. They will correct it, I said. Not hopeful, not uncertain, just logical. Because now the system was no longer silent. It was documented, tracked, visible to people who understood exactly what had happened and why. Keep your line stable, Mark added. Do not adjust anything else until we get formal confirmation. I will not, I replied. The call ended, and for a moment, the house returned to its quiet state, the only sound the faint trickle of water still running through the pipes. But it felt different now. Not isolated, not vulnerable, connected to a larger framework that had finally been activated. I walked back to the window and looked out at the neighborhood, at the shifting patterns of movement, at the growing awareness spreading from house to house. They were all part of the same system. They just did not realize it until it stopped working. And now, for the first time, neither did Linda. The next shift did not come from a phone call. It came from the street itself. I noticed it first in the way people were no longer just stepping outside to check their vents or glance at their meters. They were gathering now, small clusters forming at the ends of driveways, conversations overlapping, hands gesturing toward houses that no longer felt the way they should. The rhythm of the neighborhood had broken completely. I stood by the window, watching it unfold, tracking the pattern the same way I would track pressure changes across a live system. It started at the far end of the block, then moved inward, house by house, like a slow wave pushing through the grid. A man in a heavy jacket knocked on his neighbor's door, waited, then shook his head when it opened, and whatever answer he got did not make sense. Across the street, Mrs. Harper stepped out again, this time without the casual wave, her posture tighter, her movements quicker, checking something on her phone before looking up and scanning the street, as if expecting an explanation to appear. This was the phase where confusion turned into alignment. People comparing notes, realizing it was not just their house, realizing it was connected. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was not Linda, and it was not the utility. It was a text message from a number I recognized immediately. Daniel Reeves. He lived 3 houses down, quiet guy, worked remote, kept to himself the same way I did. We had spoken maybe twice since I moved in. The message was short. Hey, did your heat go out too? I looked at it for a second, then typed back, just as simply. Yes. System issue. Being addressed. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Hesitation. Processing. Finally, another message came through. Whole street is saying the same thing. HOA says they are looking into it. I almost smiled at that. Of course they were. That was the language they defaulted to when control slipped. I set the phone down and stepped away from the window, walking slowly through the house again, listening, observing. The cold was still there, but it had stabilized. The temperature hovered just above freezing now, no longer dropping at the same aggressive rate. The thin streams of water I had left running continued to move, uninterrupted, a quiet confirmation that the internal system was holding where it needed to. That mattered, because while the neighborhood outside was just beginning to understand the scope of the disruption, I was already past that point. I knew exactly where the pressure had shifted, exactly how far it extended, and exactly what it would take to bring it back. Another buzz, this time a different number. I answered, already expecting a variation of the same conversation. Mr. Cole, this is Officer Grant with the City Utilities Liaison. We have received multiple reports regarding a service disruption tied to your block. His tone was neutral, professional, but there was a layer of focus behind it that told me this was no longer just a neighborhood issue. Understood, I replied. There was an improper upstream suspension earlier this morning. I initiated a controlled isolation to prevent further system imbalance. A brief pause. Then, we are aware of the initial action taken by the Homeowners Association. They did not have authorization to request a service suspension at that level. There it was. Official. Confirmed. I walked back toward the kitchen, resting one hand on the counter, feeling the cold surface under my palm. Then the current condition is a direct result of that action, I said. Correct, he replied. We are coordinating with the utility provider now. We will need confirmation that the system can be safely restored. I glanced at the laptop, at the closed screen that still held everything mapped out in exact detail. It can, I said, once the improper suspension is reversed and compliance is verified. Another pause, shorter this time, more decisive. We will follow up shortly. The call ended, and for a moment, everything went quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one was different, structured, moving. Outside, the clusters of neighbors had grown, voices more animated now, phones out, information spreading faster than the cold itself. Inside, I stood there, steady, aware of every variable in play, every connection, every dependency that had been invisible just hours ago. This was the turning point. The moment where the system stopped being something people took for granted and became something they had to understand. And once that happened, control no longer belonged to the person who enforced the rules. It belonged to the one who understood the system those rules were built on. The next 30 minutes moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just sharper, like every second had more weight to it. I stayed inside, not because I needed to, but because everything I needed to see was already happening without me stepping outside again. The system was in motion now, and all I had to do was track it. My phone buzzed twice more with messages from neighbors I barely knew, variations of the same question, the same confusion, the same underlying realization that something bigger than a single home was happening. I did not respond to all of them. Not yet. Information spreads cleaner when it is not cluttered with too many voices. Instead, I focused on what mattered. The sequence. Cause. Response. Correction. I opened my laptop again, bringing the diagrams back up, not because anything had changed, but because clarity matters when pressure builds. I traced the same lines again, confirming isolation boundaries, verifying that the segment I controlled remained stable and contained. No fluctuation, no unintended spread. Exactly as designed. Outside, the sound of engines came and went more frequently now. People leaving, probably heading to hardware stores, to relatives, to anywhere warmer than their own homes. Others stayed, gathering closer, phones pressed to ears, voices rising and falling in uneven waves. And then I saw her. Linda Whitmore stepped out of her house halfway down the block, still composed, still carrying herself like she owned the ground she walked on. But there was a difference now. Subtle, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Her pace was faster. Her posture tighter. She moved from one group to another, speaking, explaining, managing. But the rhythm was off. Too many variables. Too many questions she could not immediately control. I watched as one of the homeowners gestured toward my end of the street, pointing, connecting dots that had finally become visible. Heads turned. Eyes followed. Attention shifted. That was the moment the system became human. Not just pipes and pressure and valves, but perception. Accountability. I closed the laptop again and stood still for a second, listening. The house creaked softly, but it was different now. Less strain. More balance. The internal temperature held just above freezing, steady enough to prevent damage, stable enough to buy time. That was all I needed. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark. I answered immediately. "We have confirmation," he said without preamble. "The Homeowners Association issued the suspension request without proper authorization. City has flagged it." I let out a slow breath. Not relief, just acknowledgement. "Expected," I said. "They are pushing for immediate restoration," he continued. "They need the segment back online, but they also need your confirmation that conditions are stable on your end." I looked around the house, at the thin layer of frost holding at the edges of the windows, at the steady flow of water still running through the pipes, at the quiet resilience of a system that had not broken despite everything applied to it. "Conditions are stable," I said. Another pause. Then, "They are also asking for documentation from you. Timeline. Justification. Sequence of actions." Of course they were. Systems do not resolve without records. I reached for the laptop again, already knowing exactly what I would provide. They will have it, I said. Good, Mark replied. Because once this is logged, this shifts from a neighborhood issue to a formal review. And that does not go away quietly. I closed the call and set the phone down, then opened a blank document on the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second, not because I did not know what to write, but because I wanted the order exact. Every action tied to a cause. Every response tied to a documented condition. No emotion. No interpretation. Just facts aligned in sequence. Outside, the movement had intensified. More people now. More voices. More attention directed toward the same point. Toward me. Toward the part of the system they had never needed to think about before today. I started typing, the sound of the keys sharp in the cold air, each line building a structure that matched exactly what had already happened in reality. Because in systems like this, the outcome is never determined by who speaks first or loudest. It is determined by who can prove, step by step, that every action taken was not only justified, but necessary. And as I laid that sequence out in front of me, clear and undeniable, I knew something Linda did not. This was no longer about restoring heat. This was about redefining who actually had control when the system stopped behaving the way she expected. I did not rush the last step. That is the mistake people make when they think they are about to win. They speed up. They lose precision. I finished the document first. Every line clean. Every timestamp aligned. Initial suspension initiated by HOA without verification. Environmental conditions, minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Risk assessment, structural and system damage. Protective isolation executed under easement authority to prevent further imbalance. No exaggeration. No emotion. Just sequence. I read it once more, then sent it to Mark and the city liaison in a single thread, attaching the relevant diagrams and the exact clause that governed my action. The moment I hit send, the situation stopped being local. It became official. Outside, I could hear it before I saw it. The low idle of a utility truck rolling into the block, heavier than the normal traffic, followed by the crunch of tires over packed frost. I stepped to the window and watched as two vehicles pulled up near the corner access point, both marked, both deliberate in their placement. Doors opened. Two technicians stepped out, bundled against the cold, moving with the kind of focus that comes from knowing they are walking into a situation already escalated beyond routine. A third car followed. City. That changed the tone immediately. Conversations in the street shifted. People stepped back slightly, creating space, watching instead of speculating. Authority had arrived, but not the kind Linda was used to controlling. I saw her approach them, still composed, still holding that posture of control, but now she was explaining instead of directing. That difference matters. One of the technicians knelt by the access hatch near the corner, the one they had used, and within seconds I saw the slight tilt of his head, the recognition. Not confusion, not uncertainty, recognition. Because once you know what you are looking at, systems tell the truth very quickly. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Officer Grant. I answered immediately. "We have reviewed your documentation," he said, his tone more direct now, less neutral. "It aligns with what we are seeing on site." I leaned against the counter, watching the technicians work through the window. "Then you understand the sequence," I replied. "We do," he said. A brief pause. Then, the Homeowners Association did not have the authority to initiate a suspension under these conditions. That action created the imbalance. There it was. Not implied. Not suggested. Stated. I exhaled slowly. Not relief, just confirmation. "What is the next step?" I asked. "We are instructing the utility to restore your service first," he said. "Then we will coordinate a controlled reactivation of the isolated segment." Correct order. Cause reversed before effect. That was how you stabilized a system without introducing further risk. "Understood," I said. I ended the call and set the phone down just as the first change inside the house made itself known. It was subtle, almost easy to miss if you were not paying attention. A faint click from within the walls. Then another. A shift in pressure. A slight movement of air through the vents, barely there at first, then building, steady, controlled. I walked over and held my hand near the vent again. Warmth. Not full yet, but present. Returning. Restored in sequence, exactly the way it should have been hours ago. Outside, the technicians had moved from the first access point to the one on my property. One of them looked up briefly, scanning the house, then nodded once, almost to himself, before continuing his work. No confrontation, no accusation, just correction. Linda stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of the conversation, her presence still there but diminished, her role shifting from authority to participant in something she no longer controlled. The neighborhood watched in silence, the earlier confusion replaced by a clearer understanding that something had gone wrong, and that the fix did not come from the person who claimed control, but from the system itself being corrected by those who understood it. I stood there in the kitchen, feeling the temperature begin to climb, degree by degree, the house responding the way it was designed to, and I realized something simple. Control is not about who can shut something off. It is about who knows how to bring it back without breaking everything connected to it. And in that moment, with the heat returning, the system stabilizing, and the truth now documented and visible to everyone involved, there was nothing left for Linda to manage. Only consequences to follow. The warmth did not rush back in all at once. It never does. Systems like this recover the same way they fail, gradually, in controlled increments, each layer stabilizing before the next one engages. I stood there, hands still near the vent, feeling the air shift from cold to neutral, then from neutral to something that carried the faint promise of heat. The kind of change you do not notice if you are distracted, but unmistakable if you are paying attention. The thermostat ticked upward. 36, 38. Slow, steady, exactly how it should be. Outside, the movement had changed again. The clusters of neighbors were no longer tight and uncertain. They had spread out, watching the technicians instead of each other, following the process rather than questioning it. Understanding replaces confusion quickly when results start to show. A few garage doors opened again, this time not out of habit, but to check, to confirm, to feel that same shift I was feeling inside my own house. I stepped closer to the window and saw one of the technicians speak briefly with Officer Grant, both of them nodding, both of them looking toward the access point on my property before moving on to the next phase. Clean, coordinated, the way it should have been handled from the start. My phone buzzed once more. This time, it was not a call. It was a message thread that had clearly been created in a hurry, multiple homeowners included, names I recognized only from mailboxes and passing nods. The first message was simple. Heat is coming back on over here. Then another. Same here. Then another. Ours too. Confirmation spreading the same way the disruption had, but faster now, more organized, more certain. I did not reply. I did not need to. The system was speaking for itself. I turned away from the window and walked slowly through the house again, listening. The creaks had softened. The sharp tension in the walls had eased. Even the air felt different, less aggressive, less invasive. This was what stability sounded like. Not silence. Not absence. Balance. I stopped in the hallway and placed my hand lightly against the wall, feeling the faint vibration of air moving through the ducts, steady, controlled, predictable, exactly the way it had been designed to operate. Outside, I could see Linda again, but she was no longer moving from group to group. She stood near the curb now, speaking with one of the city representatives, her posture still composed, but the dynamic had changed completely. She was no longer directing anything. She was answering questions, clarifying actions, responding to a system that had already moved past her control. A few homeowners stood nearby, not confrontational, not aggressive, just present, listening, watching, forming their own understanding of what had actually happened that morning. Perception had shifted. And once that happens, it does not shift back easily. My phone buzzed again, this time a direct message from Mark. Restoration confirmed across your segment. City is logging the incident. HOA action is under review. Short, direct, final. I read it once, then set the phone down on the counter again. The thermostat clicked up another degree. 41. The house was no longer in danger. The system had corrected itself. Not by force, not by argument, by sequence, by structure, by understanding exactly where control actually existed and how it needed to be applied. I walked back to the kitchen and turned off the faucets one by one. The steady streams of water no longer necessary. The pipes now safe. The pressure normalized. The sound of running water faded, replaced by the low, consistent hum of a system doing exactly what it was built to do. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth continue to build, letting the house settle back into its natural state, and I realized something that did not need to be said out loud for it to be true. This was never about retaliation. It was never about proving a point. It was about restoring balance to a system that had been misused by someone who thought authority meant control. But authority without understanding is just pressure applied in the wrong place. And when that happens, the system does not break randomly. It corrects itself through the only path that actually works, the one built into it from the beginning. By the time the house reached a steady 68 degrees, the silence had returned, but it was not the same silence from that morning. This one was earned, balanced, the kind of quiet that comes after a system has been pushed, tested, and corrected back into place. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching the last traces of frost melt away from the edges of the window, the glass clearing slowly until the outside world came back into full view. The neighborhood looked the same on the surface. Same houses, same driveways, same trimmed lines of lawns now dusted with a thin layer of melting frost. But the atmosphere had shifted in a way that did not need to be announced. People moved differently, slower, more aware. Conversations happened in smaller groups, quieter, more deliberate. There was no confusion left, no speculation, just understanding. The kind that settles in when something invisible becomes visible for the first time. My phone had stopped buzzing. No more questions. No more updates. The system had stabilized, and with it, the need for constant communication had faded. That was another sign everything was back where it needed to be. I stepped outside one last time, the cold still present, but no longer aggressive, just part of the environment again instead of something working against me. The air felt lighter, or maybe I just did. A few neighbors glanced my way as I walked down the steps, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with recognition. A subtle shift in eye contact. A small nod from Daniel across the street. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. They did not need an explanation. They had felt the system fail, and they had felt it recover. That was enough. Down the block, the utility trucks were gone. The city car was gone. The access points sat flush with the ground again, undisturbed, silent, doing exactly what they were designed to do without drawing attention. I walked over to the edge of my property where the easement cut through the ground and paused, looking down at the metal cover that had been at the center of everything just hours earlier. It looked ordinary, unremarkable, like it had never been touched. That is the thing about real control. It does not leave marks when it is done correctly. It restores things to the way they should have been all along. Behind me, I heard a door close and turned slightly to see Linda stepping out onto the sidewalk. She did not approach. She did not speak. She just stood there for a moment, her posture still composed, but without the certainty that had defined her before. Our eyes met briefly, and in that silence, there was no need for words. The system had already spoken. Authority had been measured, tested, and recalibrated. And the outcome was not determined by who held a title or enforced a rule. It was determined by who understood the structure those rules depended on. I gave a small nod, not as acknowledgement of her, but of the situation itself, then turned back toward my house. The warmth hit me again as I stepped inside, steady, reliable, exactly the way it should be. I set the coffee down on the counter and glanced once more at the thermostat, holding firm, stable, no fluctuations, no surprises. Just a system doing its job. And that was all it ever needed to be. Because in the end, this was never about shutting anything down. It was about reminding everyone connected to that system of a simple truth. Control is not something you claim when everything is working. It is something you prove when everything is not. And once that proof exists, it does not need to be repeated. The system remembers. The people connected to it remember. And from that point on, balance is not enforced. It is respected.